All right, hello everyone. Welcome to a discussion of the Mahabharata and fantasy. And here I have my copy of it's really more or less like a 1,000-page summary of of the epic, the Mahabharata. And we have a couple editions there. Also brought one of my copies. Actually, I have several copies of the Bhagavad Gita. So this is my most recent copy, which I had a discussion about the translator with a little while ago, which is kind of actually the inspiration for this discussion, I think, more or less. I'm here joined by these three wonderful people. Let me introduce my guests, and then we'll get into the discussion. So right next to me here is Gourav Mohanty, who is the author of this beauty right here, Sons of Darkness, which is in fact very much inspired by the Mahabharata. It is a retelling of a sort. And we all have our copies there. Cool. Yeah. And I don't know why the thumbs up thing came, but it's the new Apple thing. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, it's amazing.
So it must have been for your book. That's why it came up.
I'm glad Tim Cook approves. So that's nice.
So obviously a very appropriate guest to have here for this discussion. And also we have Mihir Wanchoo, who is part of the Fantasy Book Critic and just a fantastic guy, as well as a very important voice within the fantasy community. And obviously someone who also knows the Mahabharata. I would guess you grew up with it pretty much. Is that a fair assumption? Yeah?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And in very important ways. We're going to talk about the importance of this text in South Asia in a bit. And for my third guest, I have none other than the most brilliant MalazTuber I know, the professor, Ruthan Bad. And it is so cool to have you. Actually are a doctor now, aren't you?
Almost.
Okay.
But you forgot the most important part of my introduction, Philip. A lot of people don't know this, but I am Stephen Erickson's adopted son. My full name is Ruthan Erickson at this point, right? So.
Okay. Somebody better tell Stephen Erickson about that.
Well, my original name was Ruthan Bad. That's the family name, but then Erickson sort of purchased me with all those Malazan millions that he made.
Yes. And if you don't know Ruthan Bad's channel, and you're a Malazan reader, I don't know why you don't know his channel. It's got some just amazingly brilliant videos. And this is not the first time you've been on my channel. You were on an episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. Actually, I have to confess, my favorite episode. I'm not just saying that to be nice to you. It is my favorite episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy because I could not stop laughing. So, and you did meet Stephen Erickson and AP Canavan during that chat.
Thanks to you, Philip. Thanks to you. So I have you to thank for certain lifetime achievements here, and that's at the top of the list. And here we are again. You've introduced me to another writer, Gourav, whose book I tremendously enjoyed. And Philip, I don't think we've had a chat since I read your book. So congratulations on your trilogy, particularly book 3, which if you remember, I was a big fan of. So congratulations on that.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I can honestly say that my books, a fair part of the philosophy underlying them and the magic and everything else, honestly, having lived in South Asia myself, a lot of inspiration came from there for me in my writing. And we can maybe get into that as well. But yeah, let's talk first about this incredible epic, the longest epic known to humanity. What would you guys like to say about the Mahabharata, where it comes from, what it is? And then after that, we can talk about its cultural importance today before we talk about its relevance to fantasy today. So who would like to start us off by talking about what is this thing, the Mahabharata? For people, a lot of people on my channel, the viewers are not going to necessarily know about it. So a little bit of explanation would be really helpful.
All right. Well, I can go if that's all right.
Yeah, please do.
A lot of the Mahabharata is, along with the Ramayana, are the two cornerstone epics of Indian history, mythology, whatever you want to call it. Because in Indian languages, we call it itihas, which kind of translates to is the story or the story as it was. Now, of course, that's theological reason behind it, but you can take it like as a history, mythology, whatever. But the key part is that it basically both these epics deal with two specific avatars of Vishnu, who is one of the Holy Trinity. That's kind of like another big theological thing if you want to get into it. But the Ramayana, to simply put, is a good versus bad story.
Yeah.
That's as clear cut as it can be. It has magic, it has monsters, it has princes, everything. It has all the good stuff. But the Mahabharata, it's where things get really, let's say, Joe Abercrombie-ish. You have good guys who act bad. You have bad guys who are noble. You have guys whom you can't decide whether they're good or bad. And all of it is set into motion by the eighth avatar of Vishnu, which is Krishna. And as Philip, you put it up, the Bhagavad Gita is one of the sections of the Mahabharata.
Right.
Now, obviously, the Mahabharata started out as like a small poem. I think it was called Jaya, if I'm not wrong, which translates to victory. But then since then, it has grown, and now basically it has. You can also call it like an ocean of stories, because every part of India has a different story or different addition to the epic. And now, thanks to people like Gaurav, we have another huge bucket, or I want to say like whatever you want to call a sea, added to this ocean of stories as well. I think I can speak for both Gaurav and Ruthan and myself as Indians, so to speak, or like South Asians, whatever you want to call it. We have heard some form of it growing up, either in form of comics, TV, stories from our grandma and parents. We have heard it, and it has influenced a lot of us.
Yeah.
I'll keep quiet for now, and I want to hear what their perspectives are as well.
Thank you so much, Mihir. That's awesome. And
Thank you.
it is important. I always feel it's important to point out that it is part of a living, breathing religious tradition, that it is part of a thousands and thousands of year old religious tradition, uninterrupted. So it is different, from when we talk about it being a source of inspiration for perhaps fantasy writers today. It's a different thing we're talking about from writers who say, now there are people who have tried to revive Norse paganism and things like that, but I don't think it's quite comparable to what this is. This is an uninterrupted, thousands of years. It's so deeply ingrained and integrated into the culture that, as you say, there are TV shows, comic books, it's just everywhere. Everyone in South Asia knows about this story, and it's pervasive. So it's just kind of it's impossible. I don't know if we have anything like that in the West nowadays that is quite the equivalent, really. So I just want to
constant
emphasize that.
comparisons are drawn with the Iliad and the Odyssey, but I think that's not a comparison which is scalable, because Mahabharata itself is apparently like 16 times the size of Iliad and Odyssey combined.
Much bigger, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And the latest research and archaeological evidence dates the earliest form of Mahabharata to 2500 BCE, which is like a really long time back. We are still in 2024, so it's like, you can imagine 2 millennia back. The timeline is almost like a Malazan scale, from one era to another. So, exactly. Sorry. So the beauty about Mahabharata, if I can just add to whatever Mihir has already spoken.
Please do.
When it comes to Indian religious texts, the sources, the ancient Indian civilization, we have the 4 Vedas, which are hints or spells, if you can call it, to put it easier for our Western readers, or mantras, which speak about the way of living, the way we can invoke gods, and they're divided into 4 texts. Now, that was the sole domain of the priestly class in the Indian society. Like Indian society, in a very superficial manner, I can say that was divided into 4 castes. You have the priestly class, the warrior class, the working class, or the business class, and the working class, right? Now, what happened was, with the Vedas, they were the sole domain of the priestly class. That's why they were not accessible to the people at the so-called bottom of the ladder. Then the other source of Indian theological texts were the Upanishads, which were tales, which were used by philosophers and thinkers. Again, not accessible to the common populace. But when it came to Ramayana and Mahabharata, they were made available to the entire world at large. And that's why there are so many versions of it. Now, if you look at the main Vedas, they are unchanged. There is not a single retelling, so as to speak, because that has continued by way of the oral tradition. This is something very interesting for Western readers to know, that the way education was transmitted in ancient India was by way of hearing. It is called Shruti. So every time they used to speak something, they used to have some way of hand language or sign language. I don't know if anyone has read Long Price Quoted by Daniel.
I have.
Yeah, me too.
So a lot
stuff.
of people who have read that book kind of had a issue with the fact that he has this pose, like every time he talks about a certain thing, people are making certain poses, and that's weird to them. But no,
Mudra.
ancient Indian civilization, whenever people used to transmit all this knowledge, they used to have certain poses. That's
Mhm.
why the same priest in the north of India and the same priest in the south of India, a different priest in the south of India, will recite it exactly in the same manner. Because it's not just that memorizing it, the words, they memorize even the physical gestures, right? And that way, Mahabharata becomes very important because Mahabharata is the first text to bring out 50 shades of grey in a personality, right? And it is in that context, let me bring the superstition which is prevalent in most Indian families. It is considered inauspicious to keep a book of Mahabharata, the entire original text, in the house because that can lead to like violence between siblings and stuff like that.
Familial warfare.
Right?
Oh, because
So
it's a
simply
war between cousins.
Cousins,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But at the same time, Mahabharata itself has the holiest book in the Hindu religion, which is the Gita. The
Yeah.
Bhagavad Gita is actually a part of Mahabharata where Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, is said talking to Arjun, who's this archer in the Indian battle scene.
Ah,
Correct, exactly that scene. So interestingly, you have the holiest text of our religion in the most violent book that there is. So I love the whole dichotomy that exists there between violence and righteousness. So I think that way Mahabharata is very special. And as you said, it's still a living, breathing religion. Not only in India, but its influences are spread across Southeast Asia. And I think that's what makes it so immortal in its scope and design.
yeah, beautifully said. So, Ruthan Bad, would you like to add anything to that context in terms of what this is and its importance today in modern South Asian society?
Yeah, sure. I agree with both of what Mihir and Gaurav said. So in terms of what Mihir said, that this is sort of a Abercrombie-ish story almost, is very interesting, right? Because when we look at the two Indian epics, as he pointed out, the Ramayana is all about the greatness of Rama, the nobility of Sita, blah blah blah, of the protagonist itself. And then with the Mahabharata, we see a clear pivot in the storytelling style, where there are very, very deeply gray characters. There are no real easy answers. You could take essentially the Mahabharata and put it on another planet, and an alien race might interpret the Kauravas as the good guys and the Pandavas as the bad guys, right? And I mean, first of all, I don't need to apologize. I will say Mahabharata or Mahabharatam and Ramayanam because I'm Tamil, so I don't really do the Mahabharata Ramayan thing. I apologize in advance.
Oh no, it's
So
okay. I mean that you're actually probably giving it the more ancient correct pronunciation in that case,
well,
right?
that's because we have kind of our own translations and we have our
Yep.
own sort of versions of
It's,
it and
the
and stuff
phonetics
like
change
that.
as well, I think.
Yeah.
We are all beads in
Exactly.
the same rosary, so
Yeah.
it's perfectly fine that way.
It's perfectly all right.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right. So okay, thank you for your allowance there. So and another great trait of these epics, particularly the Mahabharata, is, as Gaurav pointed out, the significance of it is so rich that in many different countries we might not even understand the perspectives of the other person directly in terms of how they view the Mahabharata. So Philip, your exposure with it in Nepal would be very different with, let's say, my exposure of it here in Sri Lanka, or sort of a South Indian's exposure to it as opposed to a North Indians of it. Or Southeast Asians. It's something where this story has played such a rich part of history in many segments of the world population. And as you pointed out, we don't really have, or you don't really have, an equivalent in Western civilization, because yes, you have the Norse epics, the whatever, the Greek epics, blah blah blah, but as you pointed out, they are no longer relevant other than in some kind of scholarly or historical context. Whereas here, for example, the Indian election this year, one of the major points of the Indian election is the building of a temple in the birthplace of Rama of Ayodhya. So you have these things that were written thousands and thousands of years ago, which still play a very, very deep role in shaping the day-to-day lives of of its readers, of its followers, so to speak. And I just want to point out one more thing, which I always thought was quite interesting. So as science fiction and fantasy readers, particularly if you're either one of those two instead of being at the intersection between the two, there's always this debate, right? So what's more important, fantasy or science fiction? What's sort of more significant, the fantasy genre or the science fiction genre? And you could argue that when we look at the modern history of the two genres, science fiction has been far more important and far more influential. Just in modern terms, I mean, for example, the way Jules Verne shaped our imagination of flight and underwater travel, the way H.G. Wells sparked our imagination about time travel. And even though before that, physicists were sort of discussing time travel and things like that, this kind of created an explosion of interest. Or you could go into modern robotics conferences and modern robotics seminars and find experts discussing Asimov's laws, right? So science fiction has a big role. Whereas, I mean, come on, a Lord of the Rings, really? Yeah, they were good. I mean, the book's all right. The Peter Jackson movies were quite influential, I suppose, but they certainly didn't shape the ideas of mankind in the modern era the way that an Isaac Asimov or a Jules Verne did.
Right.
However, with all that being said, where fantasy really shines is in the age of mythology and in cultures where mythology is allowed to be transmitted from one generation to another, which is what we see with something like the Mahabharata. And this is where we see the real power of the fantasy genre. So for all you fantasy fans out there who might be a little disappointed that science fiction plays a much bigger role, fear not, because we do have things like this. I mean, Gaurav pointed out the oral tradition, and that's so important in terms of preserving this, right? Because once again, there's this misconception that a lot of modern readers and even modern historians have, that written history somehow lasts and oral history somehow does not last. And there's this perception, but what they forget is that, yeah, written history can exist in a written form, but it can be twisted and turned in any way that you want. Whereas oral history preserves the original source material a lot. So for example, let's say the story is Gourav and Mihir walked into a bar, right? Let's say that's the story here. So what they would do is, for the first day, I would have to say Gourav, 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 Gourav. The second day, I would have to say Gourav and, Gourav and, Gourav and. And the third day would be Gourav and Mihir. So it's you're not allowed to progress to the next verse until you've mastered the previous one. So you're almost made to absorb it in this robotic, mechanical fashion where the entire thing is preserved precisely as it was, which is why something like the Vedas has been preserved more or less in an unchanged form. The other final point I just want to touch on is in terms of the historical timeline. As Gaurav pointed out, modern historians date it around 2500 BC, but it's very, very possible. In fact, it's very, very likely that this timeline will be pushed back even further, because just 20 years ago, the historical quote-unquote consensus was that this was only about 2,500 years old. And now as we keep going, so during the colonial days, and I'm sure Mihir and Gaurav would know about this, during the Indian colonial days, or at least during the 1800s and 1900s specifically, there was a major historical debate between the German historians, the German Indologists, and the British Indologists. The Germans always believed that Vedic culture, what they call Vedic culture, was at least 8,000 to 9,000 years old, that it was far more ancient than what anyone gave it credit for. British historians like Max Muller, for example, were insistent that this was only about 2,000 to 2,300 or 2,500 years old, because, of course, for their political reasons, they had to sort of link it up with their own heritage and to show that there's some kind of historical continuity. And of course, I mean, the German Indologists had their own agenda as well, right? I mean, God knows we know what that is. But in terms of the history itself, there's there's a high possibility that we're dealing with a story that's even more ancient than we actually think. So I'll stop rambling here, but there's a lot more that we can discuss in terms of both the moral and philosophical richness of these stories.
Oh, yes. Speaking of which, I mean, you mentioned, I think it was Mihir who mentioned right from the beginning the idea that the Mahabharata is in some sense a kind of grimdark tale. And it in the Bhagavad Gita especially, which we mentioned, that very holy text that is at the heart of the Bhagavad Gita, or at the heart of the Mahabharata, you have this episode of transcendence where you have this warrior Arjun who is confronting the opposing army and seeing all his cousins and mentors and all these people over there he knows, and he's saying to his charioteer, who is Krishna, who is much more than just his charioteer, of course, how do I do this? I can't do this. I can't. And then Krishna gives him his spiel. He gives him his lecture about duty and about transcendence, and he shows him his divine form and shows Arjun the universe. Essentially, it's one of the most transcendent moments in all of literature. And so, yeah, I can see where this could be a source of great inspiration for so many kinds of tales. And yeah, this is, I guess, a good segue then for us to talk about what is the importance of the Mahabharata today in terms of writers, people like you, Gourav, who have taken this story and you have given it a modern twist. You've given it a modern form. You changed things. We talked about how Ruthan Bad mentioned that, you know, you wouldn't necessarily know who are the baddies and who are the goodies if you weren't from the culture. And you've actually done something interesting in your tale, haven't you? In those terms, without spoiling anything, you've done some interesting things, and I think one of the greatest strengths of your retelling is how you have used this very traditional ancient text as a critique of modern society in some ways. I thought you did a brilliant job with that.
Thank you so much, Philip. I think my idea was that given the current political climate that we find ourselves in, especially in India and generally things around us, to see that, okay, the history is always written by the victors rather than vanquished. And I'm not the first one to do this. There have been a lot of writers before me who have picked up a perspective of one of the characters, because more than, I mean, if George R. R. Martin thinks he has a lot of POVs, he has no idea Mahabharata has like hundreds of POVs in that sense, because there are so many major characters and protagonists. So in that sense, a lot of authors have picked up certain characters to spotlight them, you know, so that they do not remain just a footnote in the entire huge, beautiful epic. And that was my idea with Sons of Darkness. That's why the title is so, to kind of show the side, or at least from my imagination, reimagine them in a world where, you know, you kind of try and understand their motivations so that you can dissect the anatomy of a villain better. But you know, can I just step back for a bit?
Absolutely, yeah.
The point which you so beautifully said, that the moment Krishna, as a charioteer, began to speak about the transcendence and the illusion of the world, and how it might have inspired other writers, I think one of the first people it inspired were the Wachowski twins who made The Matrix. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And because now what happens, and if I may throw some light on this, and this is something which is so dear to my heart, because Matrix is one of my favorite movies, especially when it comes to sci-fi in that sense.
Especially the first one.
Correct, the first one was absolutely brilliant. Now, when Krishna speaks about the entire theology of what we are, he said that everything you are thinking of, everything you touch, is an illusion around you. It's something which is called Maya. Maya is like the Sanskrit form of matrix, let me put it that way. So his idea is that when saints and sages, they do penance, you know, when you attain nirvana, your eyes open and you see the illusion around you, and you ascend to a level where you see the world for what it is. You know, you ascend to a level where you're on the cosmic plane with the gods, and you know that everything, people around you, they don't really exist. They're all dusts of dreams, if I can take a title from Malazan.
Sure.
Right? And this is what Matrix does. Matrix creates this entire thing that once your eyes awaken, once you wake up, Neo, you will wake up, you'll take the red pill, and you will wake up to the actual world that exists, because what you're living is a simulation. So this entire, in fact, there is a whole conspiracy theory that we are in some virtual simulation of some kind, This is something which has been there in Mahabharata for the longest time. In fact, a quote from Mahabharata itself can best describe, and I think Mihir, Ruthan, we all know this quote in some way or the other, will best describe the influence of Mahabharata on all writers around the world, whether they know it or not. Mahabharata has this line which says that what is found here may be found elsewhere, but what is not found here does not exist.
Yeah.
Because Mahabharata is so deep, be it nuclear weapons, time travel, flying machines, in species. Before the hobbits, you had Nagas. Before the centaurs, we had Kinnaras. There are so many creatures that are there in terms of magical elements. Avatar, the elemental magic, that's there. You have chakras. Everything in some way or the other has been there in the Mahabharata, where they don't even treat it as magic. They treat it like, let me put it, magical realism, the way Brandon Sanderson says, where the storms are like a part of your life. Similarly, this magic was a part of their lives. And in that way, even, sorry, I'm completely segueing here and there. I'm sorry about that. But even the Wheel of Time, and this is something which, for the first time when I read the book.
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Similarities there, especially when the Saidin and the Saidar energy, the male energy and the feminine energy, that has a direct corollary when it comes to our religion, when it comes to Shaktism and Shaivism, which is the male energy and the female energy, where our theology says that once you combine them, the male and feminine energy, that's when you attain some level of, universal soldier level power. That's how
the one power.
The one power. Right?
Well, there's reincarnation in there as well.
All kinds of ages. The Wheel of Time itself, the title has been taken from the fact that across most religions, time is a linear concept. But when it comes to ancient Indian civilization, again in Mahabharata, the time is circular. You constantly have ages. And in that, and actually, if I may just add one more thing, that's why the Ramayana is like the Lord of Rings of our theology, which is completely good versus bad, because it was based in an age where morality was still, or like dharma, was still standing on three legs. You have basically this representation of dharma as a four-legged stool or something, or like a four-legged horse. And when Ramayana was written, and according to that date, Ramayana was like thousands and thousands of years before the Mahabharata. So when Ramayana takes place, there is still a marked differentiation between good and bad. But when the Mahabharata takes place, that takes place in the third age, the Dwapar Yuga, right at the end, when the present age is about to start, which is called the Kali Yuga.
Right now, we're in the Kali Yuga. Yeah.
We are in the Kali Yuga. Yeah, we're in the age of darkness. So since it is about to start, that's why Mahabharata represents the duality of good and evil in that sense, because it is a reflection of the time in which it was written, perhaps. So I think this is what I really wanted to bring out when it comes to Sons of Darkness, the darkness of the characters, and maybe there is light in them as well. Because when we follow this unidimensional perspective, one good versus bad, then you are not understanding, in my opinion, the depth of the Mahabharata epic as it has been interpreted by across civilizations and states in India and across. So that was the whole idea with Sons of Darkness.
Yeah, cool. Mihir, go ahead.
To add a little bit to what Gaurav also said, I just want to highlight one thing. Gaurav, Ruthan and me, we are from if you trace back our heritages, we're from different parts of India. I'm from, my ancestors probably are from the west, Gauravs are from the east, Ruthans are from the south of India. And to Ruthan's point, and Gaurav's point, the oral traditions, we all still identify culturally with the same epic because it has been told to us that way. That was something which is so rich. And to add to that, like I think Ruthan mentioned, it's in Nepal. It's in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, if you go, there's a lot of statues of, Arjuna, Krishna, the Garuda, which is
Bali, it's all over the place. Yeah,
it is, right? Because this, I want to say maybe from a millennia ago, from the Chola empires, the ships used to go. That's how the Indian culture, and of course the Mahabharata spread over there as well. And it I don't want to call it like a virus because it's like a bad, especially in this, after the pandemic, it kind of seems bad, but it's it is a story virus which infects your brain and it doesn't let go in a good way. Let me tell you this, in a really good way. And the duality, which, Gaurav pointed out, because it was the end of the Treta Yuga, if I'm not wrong, where, the horse or the beast was just tottering on one leg. And after the carnage that happened, the Kali Yuga started, because that's what Krishna's purpose was as the 8th avatar. And the duality is so fascinating. Like, we are all human beings. We all have good and bad sides. And that is what is so richly explored in this text, which is why it is so fascinating. So even if people who might love Malazan, who might love Joe Abercrombie, might love George R. R. Martin, they will find rich stories within this. And you can follow any character. And thanks to Gaurav, he has given a voice to several characters who perhaps were just not footnotes, but like small, who played very, very, very tiny, crucial roles, maybe cameos, so to speak. But he has shown a light on them, as well as other writers as well, which we can talk a little bit later.
Yeah, like you also, I think you very recently, I noticed you mentioning Chitra Divakaruni, who wrote
Yes,
a book
Palace of Illusions.
based on the perspective of Draupadi, I believe, right?
Yes.
Palace
Yep.
of Illusions, yeah.
Wonderful book if you want to read about, Mahabharata just from a solo Draupadi's or Panchali, as she refers to, because she's from the land of Panchal in the book. Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful book. And of course, there's other authors as well who have written several epics, one of which is one of my all-time favorite books. But
And for those unfamiliar with who Draupadi is, I think one of her most famous, one of the most famous points about her is that she was married to all 5 of the Pandava brothers.
So imagine her as Sansa Stark, who suddenly turns into Cersei Lannister. I think that's like the shortest description I can give of her, which does not do her justice, but for the uninitiated, I think that's the shortest summary I can give of.
Yeah. So, Ruth and Bad, you have actually done some, I have to say, very insightful videos on connections between Hinduism and my favorite series of all time, your favorite series of all time. I know Gaurav is a huge fan as well. I don't know, Mihir, have you read the Malazan Book of the Fallen yet?
This is the part where I'm going to make all 3 of you mad.
The odd man out. Okay. Yeah.
I'm one of the people who gave up after book 5, because I read Malazan. This was when I was starting out in the early 2000s, because back then when I was in India, you could hear a few epics, and Malazan was the one which was really talked about on all the forums. And so I dove in with lots of anticipation and excitement. And after book 4, and I think somewhere in book 5, I was like, this is not for me now. So since then, I'm not a Malazan person. I'm sorry, but I'm just not.
We'll forgive you. We'll allow you to stay. It's okay. But Ruth and Bad, I do
already giving him the death glare.
Yeah. But Ruth and Bad, I do want to get your perspective on this, and if you want to say something about Malazan to help maybe push Mihir in the correct direction as well.
I was just going to say, look, we all quit Malazan, right? So I quit Malazan like 4 times when I read that series. And when I finished it, I was like, yeah, this is not bad, whatever. If I had known when I finished Malazan, 8 years ago, that I would one day have a Malazan channel, I would have said, get the fuck out of here. That's absolutely impossible. It's a good series, but certainly not good enough for me to spend my time just doing a Malazan YouTube channel. But it's the type of story where once you finish the entire series, there are moments which stay with you when you read. So, because as Philip will attest, rereading the Malazan series is the real magic. The magic is not reading. Reading the series is just something that we do the first time so that we can get to the rereading experience. That is where the real magic of the series happens. But don't worry, if you quit, that's absolutely not a problem at all. We've all quit Malazan at some point of time. I refuse to believe any person who tells me that they are a Malazan fan and that they just read book 1 to book 10 without any reservations or problems. I'm deeply suspicious of such people. So Mihir, you do pass the vibe check. Don't worry.
In my defense, R. Scott Bakker wowed me more, which is why then I think I shifted on to him. Like I was reading both like his series and Malazan kind of because they're both really dense. And I was like, I was reading one book, but somehow R. Scott Bakker resonated more with me. So one Canadian for the other. I'm sorry, that's
He's
like
a great writer too. I mean, Baker is a great writer as well. So
yeah. I mean, so if I could just segue that conversation into what we were sort of discussing earlier. So you complimented Gaurav that he had kind of how do I say, reinvented some of the Mahabharatan tropes, and he had sort of incorporated into modern fantasy, and Gaurav pointed out that he was not the first one to do it. I will point out though that he was the first one to do it without making me cringe. So that's sort of a that's always there. That's always a plus point, right? In terms of what you said, the Bhagavad Gita and the overall application of the Mahabharata itself. So as Mihir and Gaurav have pointed out, just the sheer breadth of the topics that were discussed there. So the Bhagavad Gita itself, I mean, as William Wharton pointed out in your conversation with him, Philip, that's just one book. It's the entire Mahabharata, exactly. The entire Mahabharata is like 100,000 verses and something like 18 books or 19 books or something. And the Bhagavad Gita is just, I think, book 6 or book 7. I can't remember what the exact number is off the top of my head. But the point is that it's about statecraft, it's about philosophy, it's about ethics, family, love, life, death, strategy, economics, the social fabric of your society. There is no real end to the list of thematic explorations that we see in the Mahabharata. And what's amazing is that it's not just the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita might be the most famous aspect of the Mahabharata in terms of these discussions, but the entirety of the Mahabharata is filled with these discussions. The entirety of this tale is filled with very, very deep philosophical questions that are being explained, right?
Sounds like Malazan.
As like Malazan. And as like Malazan, it is a framed narrative where the story is explicitly being given to us through the perspective of a narrator. So the Mahabharata, we say it's narrated by Vyasa. Ramayana, we would say Valmiki. Then there are other interpretations like the Kamba Ramayanam, which came in South India in the 10th and 11th century, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, the Hindu epics and the Mahabharata they are framed narratives in the sense that this is a story being given to us by a person, and this person is narrating what he recollects as actual historical events that have happened in this world, right? So throughout the story, we are always reminded that this is being given to us from Vyasa's perspective. This is Vyasa's version of what exactly happened. So there's that sort of similarity as well. And the other thing that I want to point out was this: when we look at what modern fantasy writers or readers or whatever can learn from it, it's that there's a certain richness to the imagination, which is what determines what an epic is. An epic is not just a battle sequence with 100,000 soldiers on one side and 1,000,000 demons on the other side, right? Anybody can do that. What makes an epic is the richness of the author's imagination, the richness of the canvas of the storytelling that the author's using, the sort of the vastness of the atmosphere that the author's trying to capture here. These are the things that actually determine whether something is an epic or not, right? I mean, let me just give you an example. So you guys praised Backer, and that's fine, right? I mean, I have absolutely no problem with him. So Philip, he's the one who wrote this book called Neuropath, right? I can't remember.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
I have not read that, but yes, he's the author of that as well. I've only read the Prince of Nothing trilogy myself.
Okay. So if you guys are his fans, I'm about to pull a Mihir here and make all of you hate me. So I thought that was one of the most intellectually feeble books I'd ever read.
Neuropath. You mean Neuropath?
Yeah,
It's a thriller.
Yeah,
it's a thriller.
Because it's clearly meant to be a nihilist philosophy where he talks about how life has no meaning and emotions are just a part of the chemical reactions in your brain. There's no such thing as free will because these are all just results of chemical reactions in your brain. And the people in that story go, wow, no way. I mean, this is stuff that we learn in school. the stuff that we learn in school, that all of this is a process of neurological sort of mechanisms in our brain, the big bad guy in that book, his thesis is that there is no free will and that this is all just your brain telling you stuff. And everybody in the book's like, wow, boom, their mind's blown, right? And I've been told that the Prince of Nothing has a similar concept as well.
It does
Where
explore
Kind of, yeah.
free will.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
and
But I
anyway,
think
so
then in a much more nuanced way, I would say.
I hope so. I hope so. I certainly
Yeah.
hope so, right? Because this was just terrible. I mean, my point was that the Mahabharata written 10,000 years ago will not have stuff like that. In fact, many of the things that blow the minds of the people in the Mahabharata will blow our minds in the 21st century
Oh
as
my
well.
goodness.
Many of the things that these people find fascinating, we will find fascinating in today's day and age as well. So it's also unique in the sense that it holds up very, very well, which is amazing, right? I mean, how many epics does Gilgamesh actually still hold up? I mean, the Odyssey, I suppose, still holds up in a certain way. The Iliad, I would say, it certainly doesn't. I mean, the whole Trojan horse thing, it might have seemed, it might have struck people as a really complex tactic at that time, but it's just silly at this point of time. But in the Mahabharata, the tactics that are discussed, the statecraft that's discussed, the economic policy that's discussed, all of that still holds up today. You could have actual deep academic discussions on these things even in the 21st century, which is why, once again, you can use that as a bedrock of a religion that's lasted for thousands of years, because if it got outdated, the religion would die out, kind of like what happened with all the other religions that were built across certain myths. But because this never gets outdated, so to speak, the march of Hinduism itself keeps continuing.
Wow.
If I
I
can
don't
just
know.
add to that, that was so beautifully put. And if I can bring a slightly lawyer's perspective, so there is this concepts in international humanitarian law called Hughes ad bello and Hughes something else, which is basically rules of warfare, like how you're
Use
supposed to take
at
care of
Bellum
business.
and use at Bello.
Well, I'm really sad that I did not get the entire thing. Thank you, Ruthan. Perfect. So these are like laws of warfare, and especially how to take care of prisoners of war, what rules you're supposed to observe. All of that is like beautifully codified in statutes of ICJ or be it UN resolutions, la la la. Now, all of this can find its genesis in the rules adopted in the ultimate war in the Mahabharata, which was called the Dharam Yudh, which means law of the battlefield there, or like a righteous war. So rather than make it a siege, or rather than make it like an attack where someone's trying to like break into someone's fortress, both the sides decided that they're going to play according to the rules of war. They're going to meet every day at sunrise and wind up by sunset. And it had very detailed guidelines on how to take care of prisoners of war. You know, how they're supposed to offer water and whatnot, and humanitarian aid, no matter even if it's the enemy. And how a higher class warrior, like, because, you know, you had stratifications even when it came to warriors. Like, let me put it this way, Achilles will not fight a common soldier. It was those kinds of rules which were, I mean, ultimately they were violated, but that was the whole idea. And that's so amazing that at that point of time, you had this codified law of war. And this is just the law. Even when it comes to military stratagem, and this is where I feel that Mahabharata is like 9x level when it comes to the Troy. Because if you read Homer's Troy battle, people are just going here, left, right, and center, battling people. And whenever there is some sort of an issue that happens, a Greek god will come in on either side of the warriors and whisk them away. And, you know, there's a lot of deus ex machina in that sense that happens. But when it comes to the Mahabharata, if you look at the war formations, every day the war general used to come in and decide a war formation. One side will have one battle formation, the other side will have something else. It's like Ender's Game, you know, of sorts, where you have very complex battle formations that are still studied today. You know, and these both battle formations will meet and how you break each other's battle formation. And that was so amazing, so scientific in its own way. And the fact that they did this 2,500 years ago is something which just blows my mind. You know,
it's amazing.
Can I just add something, Philip, to what Gaurav just said? So in terms of the sort of the legal richness of the Mahabharata, right? So as Gaurav just pointed out, in the modern laws of war, we have use ad bellum and use in bello. So use ad bellum's essentially the idea that for you to enter a war, there has to be a just cause for that.
Mhm.
You can't just sort of enter into a state of war for an unjust cause. And use in Bellum is the idea that your conduct in war has to be just as well. You can't just go in there and do whatever you want. Now, here's the interesting thing. In very, very recent modern humanitarian law, we have a new component to this, which is called jus post bellum, which is the idea that your conduct after the war has to be just as well. Now, this was never really a canon of international law in the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions and the UN sort of regulations and all that. This is a very, very recent addition to the laws of war conversation. But if you go back to the Mahabharata, in the Mahabharata, jus post bellum is a very big part of the actual laws of war that are discussed there, where you have a duty to conduct yourself in some kind of just way, even after you have won the war. So even if we were to compare the Mahabharata with 20th century laws of war, the Mahabharata is way more advanced than that.
Wow, that's fascinating. And that actually is a great segue, I think, for the final part of the conversation, because I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. But what about today? You know, you have this ancient tale that I think you all three of you have eloquently pointed out how it is just, it still reverberates today. It still has so much strength and vitality, and it speaks to so many people. And you do have authors, I think, in South Asia who are drawing from the religion, if you will, the authors, you know, who are successful. I have the original trilogy, the Shiva trilogy by Amish up there. On that you have others we've mentioned, Chitra Divakaruni and her book. You have Gourav here. Yeah, you have so many examples. And are we actually, do you think, set for what I feel could be a very exciting period of fiction, fantasy, inspired by all of these things that have just have so much of a deep part of the culture? Or is that a risky thing? Because it is part of a living, breathing religion. What do you guys predict for fantasy coming from a South Asian context, inspired by South Asia? I'm speaking as somebody myself who, as an outsider, but as a very much an admirer of South Asia and Hinduism and Buddhism, and as I said in the beginning, incorporated it's woven into my own storytelling, as you can attest, Ruth and Bad. So what's the future? What's it going to be here for the relationship between these beautiful, ancient, and still relevant epics and storytelling today? What do you see happening? Whoever wants to hear.
If I may interject a little bit before Gaurav does, because sorry, Gaurav. I'll just say, Philip, like, you know, there have been Indian authors who have been writing about this, you know, like several points. There are some famous books. I just want to point this out because there's this one book called Mrityunjay, which probably Gaurav and Ruthan might have heard about. This is the story of the Mahabharata, but from Karna's perspective, and he has been made the ultimate hero with this book. This is one of my all-time favorite books. There's also another very famous writer who does not get his due, this book called Parva, which is basically by this Indian author called S.L. Bhairappa. He has written the Mahabharata from a socio-political perspective, like, you know, if it was without the gods and everything, and he's kind of given the everyman's view to the war. Again, and then the beauty of it, he's kind of given, like, you know, he's given common stuff like what happens, like you mentioned, after the war, who digs the latrines, you know, what happened to the soldiers and stuff like that. So it's all of that is very beautiful. As a fantasy reader, I can tell you I was starving. I was starving for fantasy based on Indian mythology or Indian culture, so to speak.
So much potential, right? There's so much potential. Yeah,
it is, and it was not there. Like, I started reading fantasy, I think, in like the early 2000s. Like, I was a thriller mystery reader first, but amongst Indian fantasy, there was like barely anything. There was Samit Basu, who had written, like, you know, a Game Soul trilogy, but it was more of like taking Indian myths from here and there and mixing it with like the Pratchett kind of comedy-esque genre type, and then just giving like a wholly new tale. It was fun, but it was the alone thing. Then Amish came out later, but even then he was kind of he wasn't really dealing with the epics, he was dealing with Lord Shiva's history, so as to speak, or Lord Shiva's mythology in his trilogy. There were a few others, like there's this another author, Krishna Udaya Shankara. She's a lady who lives in Singapore. She has written these 3 books. I don't know if you can see them. I'm so sorry.
yeah.
It's about the Mahabharata, but again, from a very uh, political angle where there are no gods, but there are these people who are dealing with this thing. So there was few splatters here and there, so to speak. I honestly feel, and I know there's a lot of talk about culture appropriation. So with that being a valid point,
Right.
I honestly want Indian authors, Indian diaspora authors, and I do want non or Western authors to at least dip their feet in, because there's so much Norse mythology, there's so much Greek mythology, there's
Mm.
European centered mythology has been done and dusted with, and it is still to this day, because everybody can do like a new unique twist to it. From my reader perspective, I want more of the Indian, South Asian, subcontinental, what do you want to call it, people to use it. Just give it a try. Yes, there will be horrible attempts from time to time, but there will be good attempts. There will be writers like Gaurav coming through. There will be writers like Aparna Verma. There will be writers like R.R. Vardy. But I do want even the Western writers not to feel, because let's face it, Dan Simmons with his the book set which is set in Calcutta, he did a horrible version of like what the Kali's actual story is. Now there's always that version of going to come through as well, like where people might just twist it, because Kali on the face of it seems like a like something from like someone's horror dreams, but she's not. There's a richness to her story as well, why she is the way she is, why people fear her and still worship her. Like in the east of India, from where Gaurav is, Kali Mata is considered like a huge deal. There are pujas for her, there's stuff like that, which would and then
Oh, this
a
is
lot of like, yes,
Zelazny, Lord of Light.
so I was like, well, so see, he superficially picks at the Hindu and Buddhist mythology and then just puts his own twist to it. I have read that book. I can see why it will fascinate people, but I am also disappointed with him. But of course, he's it was a long time ago, so I don't know. But
Well, I
that's my
also
point.
think, yeah, he was writing this in the 60s, I'm bringing it up because there is the risk of, as you said, cultural appropriation, and I think that Western writers probably should be sensitive to that.
But
It's
see, in his case, he was still okay. Like, I didn't enjoy the story. I don't think he was bad in utilizing it.
no,
Dan Simmons with his Kali book was kind of more insulting, is what I would say.
It was
Like,
like
he
a
literally
racist
used the Kali
stereotype.
mythos, and I'm forgetting the name of the book. I wish I had off the top of my head,
The
but it's like a
Song of
thriller set
Kali,
in.
is that what you're
Yes,
referring
thank
to?
you. Song of Kali. Yep,
Uh,
that
so bad, so bad.
that was his book set in Calcutta, and he's basically just ruined the Calcutta city as well as the Kali's mythology.
He
Just
he
he's kind of showed
makes
it like a
he
very.
makes he makes Calcutta look like Gotham City in that
oh,
book.
Mhm.
He makes it look like some
A
kind
very
of
uncool
hellish,
version of Gotham, the dirty
yeah,
version
Yeah.
not
of
even a
Gotham.
cool version, just this hellish, poverty-ridden landscape with no
Yeah.
redeeming features whatsoever. When the reality is that Calcutta for a long time was almost the intellectual hub of
Yes.
independent India for the
sure.
first 30 to 35 years.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
So, anyways, I'll shut up now. Again, sorry.
No, I think that's brilliant. Thank you so much. So, thoughts, Gaurav, on the state of fantasy and everything else in South Asia?
I think we're just like discussing with a few friends. I feel that fantasy as a genre is going to experience something which is called the dawn of the brown, or
Oh,
something along those lines. Because now you have had Vaishnavi Patel, who has written this reimagination of a character from Ramayana called Kaikai,
uh-huh.
which did exceptionally well. Luckily, when people are reading Sons of Darkness, Patrick Leo wrote that, okay, this has intrigued me to try out Mahabharata as well, because I want to read that. Similarly, recently, another author of a friend of mine called Kritika Rao, she wrote The Surviving Sky. She
Hmm.
got a deal of writing a reimagination of a tale of a sage and an apsara, a nymph, sorry. So I kind of feel that, the same way China and Japan underwent this revolution in the fantasy era, especially after R.F. Kuang's Poppy War came out and became such a big deal by bringing Chinese mythology into fantasy. And there was this whole flood of East Asian literature that found itself in fantasy. I think that's going to happen now with South Asian ancient texts as well. Because one, we always hunger for new worlds. I think as fantasy reader, that kind of is our defining trait, that we are explorers.
Yeah.
And South Asia, in that sense, has been ignored from the world scene a lot. And there is a historical context to that. And I've repeated this in interviews, but when the Britishers came in, the empires, they started treating Greek literature as some form of high literature that should be compulsorily academic material in Eton and Oxford and whatnot. Whereas when it came to Indian religious texts, they did not understand the language. And because of that, they thought of it as heathen literature, not really appreciating the wisdom. Because anything that Marcus Aurelius has written in his book called Meditations, the whole principle of Stoicism, would not have been called Stoicism had they read Bhagavad Gita first.
Yeah.
Because it's all about how you stay still, no matter if it's grief or it's happiness. Every principle of Stoicism finds its roots in Gita, is what I think. Or at
Well,
least
I
that's what
think it's ironic because I believe that a lot of Western philosophy in the 19th century, even earlier, and I'm including German philosophers in this as well, took a lot from South Asia. That a lot of it is unacknowledged to this day, I believe. But there's a lot of borrowing of philosophy from that part. And this is something that Ruthan Bad would know more about than I do, but I'm pretty sure that's a very true assertion. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that we are going to experience a revolution soon where I hope a lot more stories come out from South Asia and just enrich the world of fantasy as a whole, because it will be so cool. Like someone is going to do a story on Vetas, which are these demonic creatures who possess people, and unless you solve their riddles, they won't let go of you, right? And that's so amazing. You're so used to ogres. Why don't you try Vetas? And I think I hope this has opened doors to fantasy. Yes, there are many authors who have done this, but they have been restricted in India to a domestic context. Like the kind of writing which is there, it's amazing, yes, but it is restricted to the domestic audience. It has not elevated to the level of fantasy world building that exists. Also because of infrastructure issues, because in India, publishers are very scared of the word count. Anything beyond 200 pages that freaks them out. Having personally experienced this.
Yeah.
So, but hopefully we're inching towards that place where it really opens a Pandora's box and we come out charging.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Ruthan Bad, what are your final thoughts on the state of fantasy in South Asia? What would your advice be to a Western writer like myself, who is inspired in many ways by South Asia? I don't think I was doing any cultural appropriation in there, but I hope not. Anyway, you can tell me your thoughts.
No, I was going to say you actually do it in a good way. So I started the last answer by pointing out that I consider Gourav to be better than his peers. So let me give you some praise, Philip. I personally thought you did that, especially the third book, did a better job than Lord of Light in terms of mixing the Hindu and Buddhist references, right? I mean, what I really liked about your story, particularly the third installment, was the way that you were able to mesh one of the fundamental pillars of Eastern mythology and one of the fundamental pillars of Western religious mythology, which is that, so Eastern religious mythology is very much about enlightenment. So we have a Krishna in the Mahabharata, we have a Buddha in Buddhism, we have a Mahavira in Jainism. Even the sages who recite these epic texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are these enlightened figures. The idea of enlightenment and people who are enlightened existing on a kind of higher plane than us, that's a big part of the Eastern tradition. And then you have the Western religious tradition, which has a big focus on martyrdom, on being martyrs. So whether this is the story of Jesus, or whether this is the story of sort of a crusade type jihad in the sort of the Islamic tradition and things like that, martyrdom is a very big part of the Western religious tradition.
A lot of saints are martyrs. A lot of saints are martyrs. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And I don't really want to spoil the end of the Edan trilogy for anyone out there, but in a way, Raven represents both the enlightened and the martyrs. I'll just put it there without ruining the overall plot, right? So he kind of draws in from both the fundamental philosophies of the Eastern and Western traditions. Now, you were able to do that, Philip, because you've been exposed to both and you've been interested in both. And that is the only way I feel this could potentially work. I mean, I certainly agree with Mihir and Gourav that the world building aspect, the mythology aspect, and all of that is just ripe for the taking. I guess the shortage is the writers who are actually capable of plucking it. You know, we have a saying that if it was just the stick that can tame an elephant, then anyone can tame an elephant with that stick. But you require a mahout to tame an elephant. You can't just be anybody and tame an elephant with the stick that the mouth has. So that's a very important point as well. And in India, at least growing up in South India, look, the Indian English-speaking elite has become democratized only in the last 10 to 15 years or so, or maybe since the mid-90s or so. When I grew up in school in the early and mid-90s, you were not cool if you spoke your mother tongue more proficiently than you did English. In school, you were much more likely to read The Merchant of Venice and Tom Sawyer and whatever the shit, and not really the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. It's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that you can actually discuss these things on an intellectual level in the English language without people laughing at you as some kind of whatever bigot or savage or whatever, right? So it's all that complex, if I could use that word, has been eroding only in the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And as that happens, we will see, hopefully, more writers who come in and more writers who start sort of harnessing many of these different elements into their storytelling as well. But ultimately, it has to be someone who understands the philosophy of these stories rather than simply the narrative elements itself. It has to be someone like you, Philip, who actually understands what they are about rather than simply whom it's about, if that makes sense. So if I could just make a huge appeal to all the South Asian and Southeast Asian aspiring writers out there, particularly in the English language, particularly in fantasy, it would be, please, 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 for God's sake, just try to cultivate some kind of understanding of these stories first, and then incorporate that into your own world building and mythology, because that works. And it's your job as in, it's the South Asian writer's job to spread this. So it was not our job to popularize European fantasy, but Tolkien and a number of other people did it. That was their job. It's our job to popularize the aesthetic of our culture. It's our job to popularize the sort of the mythological framework of our structure, right? So that's my only appeal. Please, please be careful, guys, and please don't torture me like you always do. That's my
That's brilliantly said, and that well, that is going to be our final word then. And I want to thank the three of you for a brilliant discussion. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly. You have been very generous with your insights and your time. I am really, really hopeful that we're going to see more and more great tales coming from South Asia with these beautiful, I mean, it's a incredible, the plethora of wonderful inspirations that exist there. It's like nothing else in the world. So I just can't wait for that potential to be tapped with the understanding that you so eloquently articulated, I think, Ruthan. So I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it with tales like Sons of Darkness and the others that we've been talking about. So very exciting times. So my thanks to all three of you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for having us here and for hosting this discussion on such an amazing topic. I think this itself will go a long way in popularizing the lore of South Asia. So thank you so much for hosting this.
It's an honor and a pleasure. It really is.
Isn't it ironic that it took Philip to get us here to discuss this and not some Indian booktuber or whatever, right? Say what you will about all these guys. We still need the white man in some form or the other. Winston Churchill was completely right.
Well, all I can say is I think the Indian booktubers are either not there or they're too busy discussing Bollywood or some other, I don't want to say crap, but some other stuff which fascinates them. It's like, but I'm still thankful to you, Philip, for at least hosting us and at least taking an interest. I know, with your background, you have a rich cultural background of your own, but you still have taken interest in your spouse's heritage and your spouse's heritage's culture as well. And thank you again for having Gourav, Ruthan, and me to at least talk about this. And so for all of your listeners and viewers, can at least get an idea about what a rich world is out there, which they haven't even heard about or read about. And as most people in the Western world know, they always talk about who was better, Achilles versus Hector. There's an even better duel going on between two archers, Karna and Arjun, And they're
Oh,
still
no,
debating to
no.
this day who
Yeah.
was the better archer. There's still people debating to this day. So, you can find out about that. Get to know it.
Well, we all know Karna's better, so
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, thank you again, and thank you everyone who has watched this. I will have a link to Ruthan Bad's channel. If you're a Malazan fan, you must check it out. Go and buy Sons of Darkness if you haven't yet. I heard a little bird tell me that the book 2 is getting prepared, so we're very excited for that as well. You can find. I will have Mihir's contact information in the description, as well as Fantasy Book Critic, doing the great service that he does for the community. So once again, thanks everyone, and until next time.